If you had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here writing this, I would have laughed it off. I used to think infidelity was something that happened to other people, never to me. Never to us. Emily and I had been together for 8 years, married for 5. We had a solid relationship, or so I thought. Looking back, I can see the cracks now, the warning signs that seemed insignificant at the time. But when you're in the middle of it, you convince yourself that everything's fine. You ignore the little things because you want to believe the person you love would never betray you. Emily always had a passion for fashion. She loved shopping, browsing boutiques, and finding unique pieces that made her stand out. It was one of the things I admired about her, the way she could turn heads without even trying. When a new clothing store opened downtown, it quickly became her favorite spot. She'd spend hours there, coming home with bags of clothes and accessories that she swore were on sale. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone needs a hobby, right? But then the trips started happening more often. Twice a week. Then 3 times. Sometimes even more. Her excuses were always the same: just needed some retail therapy, or I had to return something. Simple, harmless reasons that seemed perfectly believable. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the shopping trips, it was everything. The way she'd glance at her phone and smile before quickly tucking it away. The late nights out with friends I'd never heard of. The way she'd come home smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine, that I told myself I was imagining things. After all, we were happy, weren't we? We still laughed together, still shared inside jokes that no one else would understand. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Our conversations had started to feel hollow, like we were just going through the motions. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the doubt kept creeping in, whispering that something was wrong. The turning point came one Friday evening. Emily had mentioned that she needed to pick up something from the clothing store and then meet a friend for dinner. I didn't think much of it until I realized she'd been gone for over 4 hours. I tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. My stomach twisted into knots as I stared at the phone, debating whether I was overreacting. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she'd lost track of time, but the longer I waited, the harder it became to convince myself that everything was fine. I tried to focus on the TV, but the sound seemed distant, like background noise in someone else's life. My mind kept replaying all the little moments I'd brushed aside: the late nights, the guarded phone, the way she'd become more distant in the past few months. When Emily finally walked through the door just after midnight, her cheeks were flushed, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She dropped her shopping bags by the door and kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. "Sorry I'm late," she said, brushing her hair back from her face. "Dinner ran longer than I expected." "Who were you with?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just Claire," she replied without hesitation. We hadn't seen each other in a while, so we had a lot to catch up on. Something about the way she said it, so quick, so smooth, made my chest tighten. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to be the kind of husband who trusted his wife without question. But the doubt had taken root, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. Over the next few weeks, the signs became harder to ignore. Emily started dressing up more often, even when she was just running errands. New clothes, new makeup, even a new perfume that clung to her skin long after she'd come home. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off. "Can't a girl want to look good for herself?" she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her phone became a constant source of tension. She used to leave it lying around without a second thought, but now it was always with her, tucked into her purse, face down on the table, or clutched tightly in her hand. I started noticing the late-night texts, the soft buzz of notifications that she'd quickly silence before turning her phone over. When I asked who she was texting, she'd shrug and say it was just Claire or one of her coworkers. That I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Every smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, every late night that ended with a vague excuse, it all added up to something I couldn't ignore. The final straw came one Saturday afternoon. Emily had left early that morning, saying she needed to run errands. Hours passed with no word from her. I tried calling, but the call went straight to voicemail. I sent her a text, "Everything okay?" But the message sat unread. By the time she walked through the door just after 6, my chest was so tight I could barely breathe. She dropped her shopping bags by the door and flashed me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sorry I'm late," she said, brushing past me. I ran into Claire and lost track of time. "Claire again?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Emily paused, her smile faltering for just a moment before she caught herself. "Yeah, we've been trying to hang out more lately. You know how busy she's been with work." Her words sounded perfectly reasonable. But the look in her eyes told a different story. For the first time, I saw the flicker of something she was trying to hide. And in that moment, I knew the doubt that had been gnawing at me for months wasn't just in my head. Something was happening. Something she didn't want me to know, and no matter how much it hurt, I was going to find out the truth. The night after Emily came home late, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The air between us felt heavier than ever. Her breathing was slow and steady beside me, the picture of someone at peace. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every excuse, every unanswered call, every smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, it all played on a loop in my head, refusing to be ignored. That I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But that flicker of doubt had grown into a fire I couldn't put out. I turned onto my side, watching the faint glow of her phone on the nightstand. It was face down, as always. A few months ago, she used to leave it charging in the kitchen overnight. Now, it never left her side. I knew what people would say, that I should trust her, that checking her phone would cross a line. But trust only works when both people are honest. And deep down, I knew Emily wasn't. That I reached for her phone, my fingers hovering just above the screen. My pulse pounded in my ears as I hesitated. The lock screen lit up as I touched it, and for a split second, I thought I saw a name, just one word, before the screen went dark again. Ben.my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen that name before. My heart pounded harder as I stared at the phone, torn between the urge to unlock it and the fear of what I might find. But before I could decide, Emily stirred beside me, shifting beneath the blankets. I froze, holding my breath as she turned onto her side and settled back into sleep. My pulse hammered in my chest as I placed the phone back on the nightstand and rolled onto my back, staring up at the ceiling once more. Ben, the name echoed in my mind, refusing to be ignored. I spent the next day trying to convince myself that it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just a friend. Maybe I was overreacting. But the doubt wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a weight on my chest, making it hard to think about anything else. By the time evening rolled around, I knew I couldn't sit with the uncertainty any longer. I needed answers. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, phone in hand, scrolling through her social media. Nothing stood out, just the usual photos of friends, family, and the occasional selfie. But something about her posts from the past few months felt different. The captions were shorter, the smiles a little more forced. And then there were the photos from her shopping trips, pictures of outfits and accessories she'd bought from that clothing store downtown. The store's name popped up more than once, Hartley's Boutique. That I pulled up the boutique's website, scrolling through their online catalog. The clothes looked familiar, pieces I'd seen hanging in Emily's closet, tags still attached. But it wasn't the clothes that caught my attention, it was the photos of the staff. At the bottom of the page, there was a section labeled Meet Our Team, with headshots of each employee. My eyes scanned the faces until they landed on one that made my breath catch in my throat. Ben Carter, sales associate. The name stared back at me, as if daring me to connect the dots. He was young, early 20s, maybe. Clean cut, with dark hair and a smile that looked a little too confident. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Lots of people named Ben worked in retail, right? But as much as I wanted to believe that, the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. The next day, I decided to see for myself. I waited until Emily left for work, then drove downtown to Hartley's boutique. My pulse pounded in my chest as I parked across the street, watching through the window as customers browsed the racks inside. It took me a few minutes to work up the courage to step inside. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered, and the scent of expensive perfume mixed with the faint hum of background music. A young woman greeted me with a polite smile, asking if I needed help. I shook my head, my gaze scanning the store until it landed on him. Ben. He stood near the back, folding shirts with the kind of casual ease that came from repetition. Up close, he looked even younger than I'd expected, early 20s, maybe fresh out of college. But there was something about the way he carried himself, the way he glanced toward the front of the store as if searching for someone, that made my pulse quicken. I moved slowly through the aisles, pretending to browse as I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He greeted a few customers with the same polite smile he'd worn in his photo, but there was something guarded in his expression, something that didn't quite match the easy charm he projected. As I moved closer, I noticed the faintest hint of cologne, subtle, but familiar. My stomach twisted as the scent triggered a memory, the faint trace of cologne that had clung to Emily's clothes after her late nights out. I left the store without buying anything, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped back into the cool air outside. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Could it really be him? Had Emily been coming here to see him all along? The thought made my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. That night, I waited until Emily was asleep before unlocking her phone. I'd seen her enter the passcode enough times to memorize it without meaning to. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages, heart hammering with every notification I opened. Most of the conversations were with friends and coworkers, normal, harmless exchanges that only made me feel more like a villain for invading her privacy. But then I found the one I was looking for. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the thread. The messages started innocently enough, short exchanges about clothes, sales, and store hours. But as I scrolled further, the tone began to change. Flirty comments slipped in between mentions of discounts and new arrivals. A compliment on her outfit. A joke about how she always seemed to come in when he was working, and then, the messages that made my hands go numb: wish I could see you outside of work sometime. You always look so good when you come in. Maybe we could grab a coffee sometime. Unless that's crossing a line. Emily's reply was short but unmistakable: maybe. If you're lucky. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow and uneven as the words blurred before my eyes. I scrolled further, heart pounding with each message that confirmed what I already knew. The late-night texts. The excuses. The hours she'd spent at the store when she didn't need to buy anything. It was all there, laid out in black and white, and then I saw it, the message that shattered any last shred of doubt: Saturday was fun. Same time next week? The room seemed to tilt beneath me as I stared at the screen, the words burning into my mind like a brand. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else as the reality of what I'd found settled over me like a suffocating weight. There was no denying it now. My wife was having an affair, and I knew exactly who she was having it with. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with my phone clutched in my hands, staring at the messages until the words blurred together. My mind replayed every excuse Emily had ever given me, every late night, every unanswered call, every lie she had told with that same easy smile. I tried to convince myself that there had to be some other explanation, that maybe I was reading too much into things. But no matter how hard I tried, the truth was staring me in the face. She was cheating. And she was cheating with him. The guy who folded shirts and flashed smiles at customers while sending flirty messages to my wife. I don't know how long I sat there, but by the time the first faint light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. I had to confront her. I waited until she woke up, the sound of her footsteps on the stairs making my pulse pound in my chest. She entered the kitchen with a yawn, her hair tousled from sleep, looking every bit like the woman I had loved for the past 8 years. But all I could see were the words on the screen, the messages that had shattered everything we had built together. "Who's Ben?" The question came out before I could stop myself, sharp and blunt in the silence of the kitchen. She froze for half a second, just long enough for me to see the flicker of panic in her eyes before she masked it with a smile. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was light, casual, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. I held up the phone, my hand trembling despite the anger coursing through my veins. "Don't lie to me, Emily. I saw the messages. I know everything." The color drained from her face. Her eyes darted to the phone, then back to me, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "You went through my phone," she finally managed, her voice rising with indignation. "That's such an invasion of privacy, don't turn this around on me." My voice cracked with the force of everything I'd been holding in. "Don't you dare make this about me when you're the one sneaking around behind my back. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me? It's not what you think, then tell me what it is, Emily. Tell me why you've been texting him late at night, why you've been meeting him when you're supposed to be running errands, why he's talking about Saturday like it's some kind of secret code. Explain that to me." She took a step back, her eyes flashing with something between guilt and defiance. "I was lonely, okay? You've been so distant lately, always focused on work, always too tired or too busy to notice me. I didn't plan for this to happen, it just did." Her voice cracked on the last word, but it did nothing to soften the ache in my chest. "So that's your excuse? I wasn't paying you enough attention, so you ran off and found someone else? You didn't even try to talk to me, Emily. You just started lying to my face." Her lips pressed into a thin line as tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt you, but you did," I cut her off, my voice raw with the weight of everything I couldn't say. "Every time you looked me in the eyes and lied, every time you ignored my calls and came home smelling like someone else, you hurt me. And the worst part is, I trusted you. I trusted you with everything I had, and you threw it all away for what? A fling with some guy who works at a clothing store?" Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not this time. The distance between us felt too wide, too broken to mend with apologies. "I don't know if I can forgive this," I whispered, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. "I don't know if I even want to try." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Emily wiped at her tears, but she didn't say a word. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say. Without another glance, I turned and walked out the front door, the sound of it closing behind me echoing through the empty space where our life used to be. Walking out that door should have brought some sense of relief, but it didn't. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt heavier, as if the weight of what had just happened followed me out of the house. My thoughts raced as I stood on the porch, hands trembling at my sides. There was no escaping the images that flashed through my mind: Emily's face when I confronted her, the look in her eyes when she realized I knew the truth. But none of that compared to the ache in my chest, a deep, hollow feeling that seemed to spread through every part of me. I started walking with no destination in mind. The streets blurred together as my thoughts spiraled, replaying every moment of the past few months in painful detail. All the late nights, the unanswered calls, the excuses that had seemed so believable at the time. I had trusted her. That was the part that hurt the most, not just that she had cheated, but that she had looked me in the eye, time after time, and lied without hesitation. I had believed her because I wanted to believe her. Because the alternative was too painful to consider, but now there was no escaping it. The truth was out in the open, and no amount of denial could change what had happened. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, had betrayed me. And no matter how many reasons she might have given, none of them could erase the damage that had been done. Hours passed as I wandered through the city, the noise of traffic and distant conversations fading into the background. My phone buzzed a few times in my pocket, but I didn't check it. I knew it was her. Part of me wanted to see what she had to say, to read her words and try to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But the other part of me, the part still reeling from the discovery, couldn't bring itself to care. What could she possibly say that would make any of this better? Eventually, I found myself in the park where Emily and I had shared so many memories. The bench near the fountain, where we had once sat for hours talking about our future, now felt like a monument to everything we had lost. I sat down, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees and my hands clasped together. The cool air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. My mind was too tangled with thoughts of what came next. Forgiveness was a word that kept circling through my mind, but it felt like a distant concept, something that belonged to someone stronger, more forgiving than I could be. How could I move past this? How could I ever look at her again without seeing the messages, the late-night texts, the Saturday meetings that had nothing to do with errands? The images were burned into my mind, impossible to erase no matter how hard I tried. But then, another thought crept in, one I hadn't expected. What if I never found closure? What if I spent the rest of my life haunted by what had happened, unable to move forward because I couldn't let go of the past? The idea of carrying this pain with me forever was almost as unbearable as the betrayal itself. I sat there until the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. The air grew colder, but I didn't move. My phone buzzed again, and this time, I pulled it from my pocket. 5 missed calls. 3 texts. All from her. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the notifications. The urge to read her words was strong, but I knew that whatever she had to say wouldn't change what had happened. Slipping the phone back into my pocket, I stood and began walking again. The streets had grown quieter, the distant hum of traffic now a low murmur against the backdrop of my thoughts. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the past few days had settled into my bones. By the time I reached the apartment of a friend who had offered me a place to stay, exhaustion had begun to seep into every part of me. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying over and over in my mind. Sleep came in fits and starts, each time dragging me into dreams that felt too real, dreams of Emily, of the life we had built, of the future we had planned together. But each time, the dream would shift, and I would see her with him, smiling, laughing, whispering words meant only for each other. And each time, I would wake with my heart pounding and my chest aching with a grief I didn't know how to escape. The days that followed passed in a blur. Work became a refuge, a place where I could lose myself in deadlines and meetings, where I didn't have to think about what waited for me when I was alone. But even there, the memories crept in: the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her touch, the way she used to look at me when she thought no one else was watching. Each memory was a reminder of what I had lost, and no amount of work could drown out the ache that settled deeper into my chest with every passing day. Friends reached out, offering their support, but I found it hard to talk about what had happened. How could I explain the mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal that seemed to follow me everywhere? How could I put into words the feeling of knowing that the person I had trusted most in the world had chosen someone else? The words felt too heavy, too raw, to share with anyone else. At night, the silence was the worst. Alone in the darkness, there was nothing to distract me from the thoughts that circled endlessly in my mind. I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for the point where everything had started to go wrong. Had I missed the signs? Had I ignored the warnings because I didn't want to see the truth? Or had it been inevitable from the start, a slow unraveling that neither of us could stop? But no matter how many times I asked myself those questions, the answers never came. All I could do was lie there in the dark, listening to the sound of my own breathing and wondering how long it would take for the ache in my chest to fade. And the worst part was knowing that no matter how much time passed, no matter how far I tried to move on, a part of me would always remember the night I learned the truth, the night I realized that the life I thought I had was nothing more than a lie. Days blurred together as I tried to make sense of everything. Each morning brought the same heaviness in my chest, a weight that settled deep in my bones and refused to let go. The world outside moved on as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything felt different. Simple tasks became harder, conversations felt hollow, and even the air seemed heavier. No matter how much I tried to focus on anything else, my thoughts kept circling back to her, to the messages, the lies, and the man whose name was now burned into my mind that I avoided going home for as long as I could. The thought of seeing her, of hearing her voice, felt like too much to bear. Every time I pictured her face, I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes when I confronted her, the moment she realized I knew the truth. No matter how many excuses she might have, none of them could change what she had done. But even as the anger burned inside me, it couldn't drown out the ache of everything we had lost. Nights were the worst. Alone in the dark, my mind became a battleground of memories and questions that had no answers. I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for the point where everything had gone wrong. Had I missed the signs? Had I ignored the warnings because I didn't want to see the truth? Or had it all been inevitable from the start, a slow unraveling that neither of us could stop? The questions echoed through my mind, each one heavier than the last. I thought about the good times, the laughter, the late-night conversations, the moments when it felt like nothing could break us. Those memories clashed with the images of her with him, the messages that had shattered everything I thought I knew. The contrast was too much to bear, and each time I tried to make sense of it, the ache in my chest grew stronger. Forgiveness seemed impossible. How could I ever look at her again without seeing the betrayal in her eyes? How could I move forward knowing that the woman I loved had chosen someone else, even if only for a moment? But even as I struggled with the pain, another thought began to creep in. What if I never found closure? What if I carried this weight with me for the rest of my life, unable to move on because I couldn't let go of the past? The idea of living with that kind of bitterness was almost as unbearable as the betrayal itself. I had to make a choice, either find a way to forgive her and rebuild what we had, or walk away and start over. There was no middle ground, no way to pretend that things could ever go back to the way they were. After a week of avoiding her calls and messages, I finally returned home. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside, colder, emptier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension that hung between us. I could hear her moving around upstairs, the faint creak of floorboards as she paced back and forth. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in the doorway, knowing that this moment would define the rest of our lives. I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red from crying. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said. I could see the questions in her eyes, the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could still find a way to fix what was broken. But as much as I wanted to believe that, I knew it wasn't possible. Standing there, I thought about everything that had brought us to this point, the love we had shared, the dreams we had built, and the choices that had torn it all apart. I had spent days searching for a reason to stay, for some shred of hope that we could rebuild what we had lost. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase the images in my mind, the messages that had shattered my trust. The foundation of our marriage had been broken, and no amount of apologies could put it back together. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me. The words were heavy, but they needed to be said. I told her that I couldn't stay, not after everything that had happened. I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if I would ever be able to trust her again. The pain of what she had done would always be there, a shadow that lingered no matter how much time passed. Staying would only mean living with that pain, and I couldn't do that to myself. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she listened, but she didn't argue. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say. The love we had shared was still there, buried beneath the hurt and betrayal, but it wasn't enough. Love alone couldn't fix what had been broken. I packed my things that night, each item a reminder of the life we had built together. The framed photos on the nightstand, the souvenirs from trips we had taken, the little notes she used to leave for me, all of it felt like fragments of a life that no longer belonged to me. Each item I placed into the suitcase felt like closing a door on a chapter of my life that I would never be able to reopen. When I finally closed the suitcase and turned to leave, I paused at the doorway, glancing back one last time. Emily sat on the bed, her shoulders slumped, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, I almost turned back, almost wrapped my arms around her and whispered that everything would be okay. But I knew that would be a lie. Some wounds cut too deep, and no amount of love could erase the scars they left behind. Without another word, I stepped out of the room and walked down the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what I was leaving behind threatened to pull me back. But I kept moving, one step at a time, until I reached the front door. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, the faint hum of the city in the distance. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp air as I tried to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Closing the door behind me felt like closing the final chapter of a book I had never wanted to finish. The ache in my chest was still there, but beneath it was a sense of clarity, a realization that, no matter how much it hurt, I had made the right choice. Staying would have meant holding on to something that could never be whole again. Walking away meant giving myself a chance to heal, to start over and build a future that wasn't weighed down by the past. As I walked down the street, suitcase in hand, the city lights stretched out before me like a path leading towards something new. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but I was ready to take the first step, because sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that set you free. The days after I left felt like stepping into a world that didn't quite belong to me. Everything looked the same, the city lights, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of strangers, but it all felt muted, as if a layer of glass separated me from the world around me. The suitcase beside my bed served as a constant reminder that the life I had built with Emily was no longer mine. The echoes of our laughter, the warmth of her touch, the plans we had made together, they all seemed to linger just out of reach, like a dream that slipped through my fingers the moment I opened my eyes. Each morning, I woke with the heavy weight of reality pressing against my chest. The first few moments after waking were the hardest, those brief seconds when my mind, still fogged with sleep, believed that everything was as it had always been. But then the memories would come flooding back, the messages, the lies, the look in her eyes when I confronted her, and the ache would settle in my chest once more. No matter how much I tried to push the thoughts away, they clung to me like shadows, refusing to let go. Work became my refuge. The steady hum of routine offered a temporary escape from the chaos inside my mind. I buried myself in deadlines and meetings, losing myself in tasks that required just enough focus to keep the memories at bay. But even then, the questions would creep in when I least expected them. Had I done enough to save our marriage? Could I have prevented this if I had paid more attention, if I had been more present, more loving? The questions circled endlessly, each one a reminder of the life I had lost. Nights were harder. Alone in the silence of my apartment, there was nothing to drown out the thoughts that pressed against my mind. I would sit by the window, staring out at the city lights and wondering where she was, what she was doing, if she thought of me as often as I thought of her. The memories played on a loop: our first date, the day we moved into our home, the nights we stayed up talking until dawn. Each memory was tinged with the bitter knowledge of what had come after, making it impossible to hold on to the happiness they once brought me. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. The ache in my chest, though still present, began to feel a little less suffocating. The memories, once sharp enough to cut, began to soften at the edges, becoming fragments of a life that no longer defined me. I started to notice the world around me again: the warmth of the sun on my skin, the laughter of strangers passing by, the small moments of beauty that had once seemed invisible beneath the weight of my grief. It wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of everything still pressed down on me with a force that left me breathless. There were moments when I wondered if I had made the right choice, if I should have stayed and fought for what we had built. But each time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of the truth: the messages, the lies, the betrayal that had shattered the foundation of our marriage. No amount of love could erase the damage that had been done, and no amount of forgiveness could rebuild the trust that had been broken. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. The name on the screen made my breath catch in my throat. Emily. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the call go unanswered and leave the past where it belonged. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hand in mine, couldn't bring itself to look away. Taking a deep breath, I answered the call. Her voice on the other end was soft, tentative, as if she wasn't sure what to say. She asked how I was, her words careful and measured, as if afraid of reopening wounds that had only just begun to heal. I listened in silence, unsure of what I wanted to hear, unsure of what I wanted to say. She apologized again, words that felt both too much and not enough all at once. She told me she missed me, that she still loved me, that she wished she could take back the choices that had led us to this point, but as I listened to her words, I realized something that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. Love, no matter how deep, couldn't erase the past. The choices we make, the moments that shape us, they leave marks that can't be undone. I had loved Emily with everything I had, and a part of me always would. But love alone wasn't enough to rebuild what had been broken. Trust, once shattered, couldn't be pieced back together with apologies and promises of change. So I told her the truth I had only recently begun to accept. I told her that I still cared for her, that a part of me always would. But I also told her that I couldn't go back. The pain of what had happened, the betrayal that had fractured the foundation of our marriage, it was too much to forget. Moving forward meant letting go of the past, and as much as it hurt, I knew that meant letting go of her. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. She told me she understood. And maybe, in some small way, we both found a measure of closure in that moment, a recognition that while our story had ended, it had still mattered. The love we had shared, the moments that had shaped us, they would always be a part of who we were, even if we could no longer share them. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the distant hum of the city filling the space around me. The ache in my chest was still there, but for the first time in weeks, it felt a little lighter. The weight of what had happened, the grief that had held me captive, began to loosen its grip. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing would take time, and there would be moments when the memories still hurt. But I also knew that this was the first step towards something new, a future no longer defined by the pain of the past. Months passed, and little by little, the pieces of my life began to fall into place. The days felt a little brighter, the nights a little less heavy. I started to laugh again, to find joy in the small moments that had once felt so distant. The memories of what had happened still lingered, but they no longer held the power to define me. They became part of my story, not the ending, but a chapter that had led me to where I was meant to be. Looking back now, I can see the lessons hidden within the pain. I learned that love alone isn't always enough, that trust is fragile, and once broken, it's not easily repaired. I learned that holding on to the past only keeps you from moving forward, and sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead to the greatest freedom. But most of all, I learned that healing is possible, that even after heartbreak, there is still hope for something new. And as I stood at the window one last time, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, I knew that I was finally ready to take the next step forward. Not with regret, not with bitterness, but with the quiet certainty that the past no longer held me captive, because sometimes, the end of one story is just the beginning of another.